Most definitely, I can see it being workable.
So I want to circle
I
back a
would
little bit to the question which I asked before Lucas's follow up question, and it was, what's the real problem here, which you hope to solve through this three pronged approach for your kingdom?
Yeah, the real problem is um, there is no definitive path to access generational wealth for the average citizen of my country. Uh, and Bitcoin will provide that. That's one of the things. One of the other things is that Tonga, as with all countries, but even more so the developing nations, are at the mercy of the American Fed and the global North central banks as to the purchasing power of our currency, of our dollar. So the dollar that a sole trader farmer in the village gets up at 4 in the morning to work for till 8 p.m. at night, the dollar that he earns off that crop, its value is decided by people not from our country and who are unelected and are ultimately accountable to no one. So that problem is only solved by participation in another monetary system, one which is severed and devolved from that system. Uh, Even if you remain on a nation state level, having some connection to that system, at least the populace and the government as well, as much to the extent to which it wants to is completely up to itself. But it gives the population a possibility of access to that generational wealth.
So
From a
to
day to day point, we are being murdered by the commercial banks. The interest rates they charge our people are out of this world. They are very, very stingy with granting access to capital for our people, our sole trader fishermen, our sole trader farmers, and the banking services they provide in return are negligible. So our citizens need some protection uh, from external forces who decide what the purchasing power of their time is, because ultimately that's what money uh, is your time, your your time encapsulated in paper nothingness that you exchange with someone else's time that has been uh, forced into paper nothingness as well, and you exchange that paper nothingness amongst one another until, yeah, you end up with complete nothingness. And this monetary system frees us to an extent, frees us to the largest extent possible.
you
From,
mentioned three specific points, right? And I
Mhm.
want to dig into each one of them a little bit, uh,
Right,
because I think it's very important to understand your thought process. And so the first thing you mentioned is giving access to generational wealth. Right.
right.
I'm not from Tonga. I have never visited Tonga, but my guess is much like many other nations, developed and undeveloped alike across the globe,
Mhm.
generational wealth was accumulated through engaging in commerce, in business, in trade, in service, etc. Some of it might be tied to hereditary and lineage, which of course has been the case throughout history in most of the world. But the point being is that, you know, the wealth was accumulated through actions one way or another. Do you really think that, mining or holding Bitcoin actually solves that problem of wealth inequality in Tonga or any country for that matter, right? Um, the second point you mentioned was purchasing power, and which would directly relate to trade, where central banks and other nations have control over what Tonga's purchasing power is. So, with respect to that, I think the power doesn't lie within the central banks of other nations. The power lies within Tonga and its ability to be productive and to create and provide goods and services for countries outside of its domestic nation, right? With that being said, just because you change the medium of exchange, the perceived value that someone is willing to pay for the goods and services that your kingdom is providing in forms of trade, the value of the underlying trade does not change, right? So the second question is, how will having Bitcoin or having a digital ledger change the productivity of the nation, other than carving out, a business and an economy focused on mining, right? So that's a separate issue. But the underlying fundamentals of the kingdom, I don't see how those change, and maybe I'm not thinking about it correctly. Mention is having decentralization, which ties into the first 2 points, and the underpinnings of that and the fundamentals which I'm speaking about tie into that as well. So if you could maybe, dive a little bit into these 3 points for me, and maybe some of the folks in here have similar questions as I do.
Yeah, that's no worries. So no, you actually misstated the three prongs. The first prong is our national treasuries being invested in Bitcoin. That has been shown. If you go to bitcointreasuries.org, you will see the exponential increase in the value of MicroStrategy's investment, Tesla's investment with Bitcoin, as with all things. Uh, Money uh, travels a particular path to becoming uh, a, a money, as it were. You have to know the history of money, and I'm sure you do, to understand what makes money what it is. So money has to be durable, portable, divisible, uniform, scarce, and highly adopted. Bitcoin is the best at all these things in our current world financial system. So, are you saying that investing 30% of our 700 million into Bitcoin, the same thing that New Zealand has done with its national pension fund in taking 10% and buying into Bitcoin, or the fact that uh, Goldman Sachs now regards Bitcoin as an entirely new asset class that is highly investable. I'm not sure. Can you clarify which part of us making that investment will be detrimental to Tonga?
Sure, sure. So I don't
Lord,
know enough about Tonga to
what
speculate
he's
as
saying
to.
is that he hasn't read the Bitcoin standard. That's what he's saying. Read the
I don't.
Bitcoin standard.
So I guess other people can read my mind, and so maybe I don't need to clarify
Well,
at all.
she's if to be fair, had you read the Bitcoin standard, you would understand why that proposition is a sensible proposition, which any CEO, as if you'd ever seen a interview with Michael Saylor, will show you that any CEO objectively and dispassionately presented with a devaluing fiat currency, a bond market which has become negative yielding, would invest in Bitcoin objectively,
So,
all other matters aside. So,
so I'll answer
yeah.
the points that you raised for clarification. Um, you know, Goldman Sachs and other financial institutions don't have necessarily a view on Bitcoin itself. They take a stance on it because they have customers that are willing to engage in that business. And if they don't take a stance on it and they don't provide that for their customers, that revenue flows out and goes to another institution that will. And for everyone out there like Michael Saylor or executives at Goldman Sachs, you can point to 100 others that are just as credible that say the opposite, right? So that's here nor there. But the point I'm making is
No, it's
you
not
spoke.
actually.
Actually,
It's not
can you
actually.
name one that
It's not
says?
actually
Can you
neither here
name
nor
one that
there.
says the opposite? Can you just name one actual
Yeah,
learned
it's not
person?
exactly neither here nor there. That's a misstatement. I'm afraid, my friend. It is neither. It is both here and there, because it is a fact. It's a fact. If you go to bitcointreasuries.org, as I've offered, you will find that the multiple X's on each of those 100 million to $1 billion investments have increased by this year. In this year, even with the dip, Bitcoin is up 235%. So that's a misstatement. I'm sorry. When you say that's neither here nor there, it is an absolute fact that if we put 30% of our treasuries
So it
into
sounds to
Bitcoin,
me like you're saying.
Folks, I want to move on to another questioner, because this line of questioning isn't directly related to Tonga and something we can